This is one of the greatest motorsports of all time, and this is the greatest distillation of it ever put to a disc. Throughout the history of rally racing, there have been many legendary names, both through their unstoppable success and their incredible stories. Names like Ken Block, Michel Mouton, Walter Roll, and Sebastien Loeb. But among those names, one man stands out. 1995 WRC champion, Colin McRae. Colin was one of the greatest rally drivers of all time, but his stats don't tell the full story. His lone champion win may seem a bit disappointing for a driver that's so revered, but it makes more sense when you look at his driving style. He was always giving it 110%, throwing the car into every corner, cutting where there weren't any cuts, and never letting up. This led him to 25 wins over just a decade of competition, but an even more ludicrous 50 retirements in that same time. He was known as the Flying Scotsman, and his fans would often repeat his apt mantra of, "When in doubt, go flat out," which is what separated him from the likes of Richard Burns, Carlos Sainz Sr., and Tommy Mäkinen. Seeing this sport and its star driver gave a few engineers at Codemasters some amazing ideas. What if we made a game that embodied Colin's mantra and made the player feel the kind of speed and pure adrenaline you can only get from a rally car going flat out? And in 1998, they did just that. Colin McRae Rally was released in 1998 on the PS1 and PC, to generally favorable reviews from critics and fairly substantial commercial success. This game also came out right after Codemasters started another one of their classic racing franchises, TOCA Touring Car Championship, which would later evolve to become the Grid series and all of its many sequels. But this is about Colin McRae Rally. So how good does it encapsulate Colin McRae's style? It certainly encapsulates a style. Saying that this game looks janky and stiff would be very reductive and correct, although most of the jank can be attributed to the limitations of the hardware at the time, so when compared to games of the era like Gran Turismo 2 and Need for Speed Hot Pursuit, it still looks a bit janky, but not nearly as bad. Compared to other track races like Gran Turismo or the game named after one of Colin's biggest rivals, Richard Burns Rally, Colin McRae Rally is far more arcadey in its approach to physics, making it far more accessible to the casual gaming audience. Attempting to remedy the jank and improve on their formula, Cody's released Colin McRae Rally 2.0 at the turn of the millennium. I don't know why, but the UI and menus in this game remind me so much of classic browser racing games like the ones I used to play on sites like Addicting Games and Shockwave.com. Oh, those were so good back in the day. Outside of that, it's really much of the same from the first game, and on the same consoles as before as well. But that would change in the next installment, Colin McRae Rally 3. Are you starting to see a pattern here? This time releasing on PC, PS2, and the new Xbox thing Microsoft barely finished before shipping out. I would say this game is an improvement on the previous games, but I just really don't vibe with the handling in this game. As much as I compared 2 to old PC browser racers, this genuinely feels like one. I'd say it feels to me like Redline Rumble 4 Ignitro City. Does this require elaboration? Good. There is one thing I want to highlight in this game though, that nearly all the Colin McRae Rally games do, but I really like how this game does it. Just about all the games allow you to dial in nearly every component of your car, in this case down to the exact tire compound you want for each terrain, I also really like how in this game, it gives you a unique 3D model showing you what parts you're swapping out and where they are in the car. It's a small touch, but I really like it. Then we got Colin McRae Rally 04, which was, okay. Then we got Colin McRae Rally 2005, also from 04. Oh, you wanted me to talk about 04? It's if Rally 3 felt a bit better to drive and had a bigger car list. Although this game does feature a rally version of the Ford Transit van. Never mind, game of all time. 05 is actually a decent step up from 4. The physics feel better, the graphics look really good for a game still running on an original Xbox, and the car list nearly doubled from the last game. But throughout all these games, the core gameplay and feeling the game gave off never really changed all that much, which I really see as one of the early series' greatest faults. See, not to spoil the rest of the video, let me go on a small tangent about innovation and change. In any form of regularly released media, whether it be video games, TV shows, or music, there's often a balancing act that needs to be found when making the next installment in a line of content. The people who enjoyed the original will likely want something more like what they started with, maybe with some slight updates like more content, better direction, generally making it have a broader appeal, etc. Although the less you change, the more likely you are to make those people bored and never have them come back. Contrastly, you could make sweeping changes that affect major parts of the gameplay, plot, or sound of your media. This can attract people who may not have been as invested to the original ideas from the first edition, and this may be more lucrative or even more creatively fulfilling in the long term, but you also run the risk of alienating fans of the original, who thought you had a perfect product and didn't want to see anything change. See everyone under a Need for Speed video commenting something along the lines of, "We want a Most Wanted remaster." Do you want to try something new and see if your audience warms up to it? Or do you want to stick with what works? I bring all this up because the initial run of Colin McRae Rally games heavily favored the latter, meaning that if you've played one of these games, you've basically played them all. If I were to say what the best one was, it's definitely one of the last two, as they have the most content, best graphics, and the most fleshed out version of the basis that the first game laid out. Although this pattern would take a sharp turn after Colin McRae 2005. It would end up being a whole 3 years until the next Colin McRae Rally came out, and when it did, it was under a new moniker that many of you will likely be more familiar with: Dirt. Dirt was a change of pace compared to the previous titles. Instead of feeling floaty and oftentimes unresponsive like in previous titles, Dirt 1 felt a lot snappier, quick, and at some moments, actually quite exciting. This was closer to what rallying felt like. This was closer to what Colin McRae meant. And this time, you actually have a bit more freedom. Instead of just having a standard rally season to compete through, with the entire game just being rally stage after rally stage through a standard rally championship length season, you now are given a pyramid of events, each of which consisting of a small handful of races in various categories which slowly culminates to the final event. Basically, the more events you beat, the quicker you progress to the final event, but also the longer and more difficult the events become. On the surface, this might not seem like a big change, but the larger changes lie just beneath it, because the event types themselves had changes too. With the growing popularity of other rally-adjacent motorsports in the 90s and 2000s, Cody's decided to feature them more in their games, examples of which being event types like Rallycross, effectively rally cars on a small closed circuit of gravel and asphalt battling it out to see who can place first, Rally Raid, effectively just Rallycross but for buggies, trucks, and larger off-road and Baja vehicles, Core, or Championship Off-Road Racing, which was again similar to Rallycross but for purpose-built off-road buggies, and Hill Climb, which is sort of self-explanatory, although these events would often feature purpose-built cars specifically made for hill climb racing. Speaking of the cars, Dirt featured a much wider array of vehicles to choose from. You had nearly the same list of rally cars as the last installment, although with a few more of-the-time additions. Although this time there were nearly as many trucks, buggies, hill climb monsters, and long-haul semi-trucks as there were rally cars, bringing the total number of cars to 46, up from the last game's 34. The biggest improvement that I could notice was the game's physics, as they were a notable step up from the previous installments. The cars actually feel like they have some weight to them, and that becomes very apparent when driving the much heavier cars. I also really enjoyed the vibe of the game. Dirt 1 to me feels like the first Colin McRae Rally game that didn't just base all their UI design and music choices off generic BBC One and Channel 4 transitions. To me, it reminds me of another favorite of mine, and major rebranding of another series that Codemasters developed, Race Driver Grid, which was released just a mere 11 months after Dirt 1. I imagine those devs had a lot of time, but they got at least a weekend off like every 4 months. As much as I respect Dirt 1, I have a hard time calling it a favorite, or even really a racing game I would often go back to. Many of my biggest issues this game actually shares with Grid 1 as well. Firstly, as you can see, you can't see, well, that's a bit of hyperbole, but the combination piss filter and nuclear flash levels of bloom all over the screen do make it quite hard to look at, with some players reporting that after playing for several hours they experienced mild headaches from the eye strain of just looking at this. I can't knock it too much for that though, because this is far from an uncommon aesthetic circa 2007, and this would also be carried over into the next installment, although the piss filter would be greatly reduced and the bloom would be nearly taken out entirely. The other thing is the physics. As much as I complimented them earlier, that was because I was comparing them to what came before. When compared to what came after, they still feel fairly floaty and slow compared to the next installments that feel weighty, snappy, and satisfying. Although, before we go on to the next installment, the world of Rally itself would undergo a historic loss.
Police remained through the night at the scene of the crash near Colin McRae's house in Jerviswood near Lanark. Air accident investigators have yet to establish exactly what happened, but it is known the aircraft came down just after 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, with 4 passengers on board, all of whom were killed.
On September 15th, 2007, Colin McRae was piloting his personal helicopter when an unknown error was made, causing the helicopter to plummet, killing all 4 passengers, including Colin himself, his 5-year-old son Johnny, a personal friend, and a friend of Johnny's. The rallying world was devastated, as Colin had just recently left the WRC and was still actively searching for a seat for 2008. But he would never be given that chance. He was just 39. This tragedy also impacted every partnership McRae had made, and later that year Codemasters would come to an agreement with the family to take his name off all of the following entries, starting with Dirt 1, which had many of its copies sold without his name attached, and Dirt 2, which had the vast majority of them not having his name. In the sequels that followed, they would quickly take the focus away from Colin, in favor of one of his biggest and most influential fans. But before we get to that, we have to talk about the game that really solidified the Dirt name as a true classic among older racing titles. As much as I try to include a bit of objectivity in my takes, I do want to get one thing out of the way. Dirt 3 is probably the best mainline Dirt entry in the entire series. It has basically everything that makes the other 4 entries great just within it, and it looks, plays, feels, and has aged great. But despite Dirt 3 being the best, it's not my favorite, because this is. When I asked you guys what Dirt game was the best, a solid 20% of you said Dirt 2. And I would probably say that's the camp I find myself in, because this was also the first Dirt game I played all the way back in 2011. I put so much time into this when I was a kid. although I distinctly remember not being that good at it when I first played it. As someone in my comments rather arrogantly, but also not entirely incorrectly pointed out, Dirt 3 is for kids, Dirt 2 is for men. Because of the 4 Dirt entries that don't try to masquerade as a sim, this is the most unforgiving. The cars in this game feel so satisfying to drive. The game starts you out with rallycross circuits and fairly simple rally courses, but it's not long before you encounter courses that will test your patience if you're going for a win on a high difficulty. And it feels fun to start with a car or car type that you thought you knew the limits of, and begin pushing it just that little bit further to find where its true limits lie. You start extending corners further to get faster exits, you learn to look for any flat spots on the insides of corners to get a faster apex, and you also learn how to correct your car in the very real situation of you misjudging a corner. Going back to this game after not having played it since I got my Xbox One back in 2018, I realized something. This game is probably the strongest representation of Colin McRae's style. It encourages max speed and aggression, but also punishes the player if they are even the slightest bit off. And the only way to make up that time after a mistake is to go flat out. This game is also a massive improvement on the last game in other areas outside of the core gameplay. The modes from the last game are brought over into this one, although now all the modes share a roughly equal share of the total events throughout the game. The cars themselves haven't changed all that much, although they are now broken down by what event they race in instead of stuff like age or drivetrain. They also removed some classic cars like the Audi Sport Quattro, Peugeot 205 T16, and basically all the Lancias, and replaced them with a greater number of off-road trucks and purpose-built rallycross cars, so I don't see it as too big of a loss, but it is still a bit unfortunate. The game looks a whole lot better too, with the effects dialed back and the power of the 360 and PS3 being used to their full capacity. Dirt 2 genuinely looks really good for a game from 2009. I'd even argue if it wasn't for the slight urine flavor they still had left on all the tracks, it would actually look better than another favorite racing game of mine from the same time, Forza Motorsport 3, which in and of itself looks great already. The game also featured the first decently sized soundtrack in a Dirt game, although it's almost entirely rock from 2004 to 2008, which could be seen as a bit of a hindrance having only one genre be represented, similar to what I criticized Need for Speed Unbound in my last video about, but I think the music really fits the aggression of the game quite well, and to me, it actually sounds a lot like if you took the best rock tracks from Need for Speed Pro Street and Midnight Club LA and put them all on the same soundtrack, which I mean fairly literally, as several songs from here are also straight up featured on those games too. The game also featured a new mechanic which was exclusive to this entry, that being a sort of friend mechanic. Basically, the game featured a number of real rally drivers who you'd compete with throughout the events. If you beat them enough times, they would eventually become your friend, and they would then work better with the player when choosing a partner for one of the game's many team races. You had drivers like Tanner Faust, Ken Block, and Mohammed bin Sulayem, yes, that Mohammed bin Sulayem, all of which have their own preferred race types that they are best at, so you're really encouraged to pick different drivers each time instead of just defaulting to Ken Block every time. These little touches are what made it just that little bit better than all the other Dirt games to me. But as I already said, even though Dirt 2 is my favorite, that doesn't exactly make it the best one. When it comes to any piece of media, there is no such thing as a perfect work. There will always be imperfections, but when you create something that both captures a moment in time perfectly, whilst also building upon a proven foundation, that is when you get something that is truly a masterpiece. And that is the best word I could use to describe Dirt 3. When I see people talk about the greatest racing games of all time, they seldom mention either of the best Dirt games, which I think is borderline disrespectful because of just how much care you can tell went into these games. But I've done enough rambling. What makes Dirt 3 so good? I'd say it's because of what it's meant to embody. In many ways, Dirt 2 is the single best representation of the ethos of Colin McRae. But Dirt 3 is a truer representation of arguably Colin's single biggest fan, Ken Block. That means you retain nearly all of the adrenaline, rallying pedigree, grit, and pure driving excellence from the last game, but now with a cleaner and more defined aesthetic. To an extent, I could say Dirt 2 feels like the 2000s, loud, bent up, and with lots of flair, while Dirt 3 feels very much like the 2010s, more accessible, cleaner, and with almost a pseudo-corporate sheen that, while not making it feel sterile, does make it less exciting at points when compared to Dirt 2. That's the reason I would place it under 2, the atmosphere, because Dirt 3 lacks that aggression, that pure drive you have when barreling down a cliffside in a 400 horsepower Evo right after you ran out of flashbacks and need to make up a second deficit in just under a minute of track. Dirt 3 feels more beginner friendly, which has its upsides and downsides. One of the biggest selling points of Dirt 3 was that it had something for everyone. You of course still had the modes from Dirt 2 like Rally, Rallycross, Trailblazer, and Rally Raid, now just shortened to Raid, but now with the introduction of a new mode, Gymkhana, which usually just consisted of the player going around a carefully constructed course trying to gain as many points as possible by smashing signs, sliding around cones, hitting jumps, landing tight drifts, and doing donuts. And although they're certainly not everyone's favorite, they did add a greater degree of variety that Dirt 2 didn't really have. Another thing Dirt 3 does better than 2 is how it looks. Of the 4 Dirt games released on the 7th gen consoles, this is by far the cleanest. Gone is the obnoxious piss filter and bloom effects of the early games. Now every environment has its own distinct atmosphere, and when playing on a high resolution, high refresh rate monitor, Dirt 3 makes you question the fact that it came out over 12 years ago. Despite this, the game is slightly lacking in the art direction department. When compared to Dirt 2's smoky trailer, active map transitions, and really alive festival-like setting, Dirt 3 can feel kinda corporate. But when compared to some future releases, this either looks like an oversaturated Mr. Beast thumbnail or a funeral. Outside of that, Dirt 3 is just a continuation of the path that Dirt 2 had already laid out. Although, there is one notable difference: the multiplayer. I don't have the clearest idea of how Dirt 2's multiplayer experience was, mainly because it hasn't worked in years and I wasn't able to find any footage of it. However, I still think Dirt 3's multiplayer is better because of the new event types. Yeah, you can still make a lobby with the standard event types like Rally, Raid, and Rallycross, but now you can make stuff like Gymkhana, which is the same as the base game, Outbreak, which should be very familiar to any of you who've played Forza Online, Invasion, which is a Gymkhana style event about smashing cardboard cutouts of aliens, and Transporter, which I don't fully understand. It's kind of like a capture the flag sort of thing, with a thing you need to take from the other players and place you have to take it. The thing that really impresses me here is that it's been 12 years and the servers are still up, and still populated, which is more than I can say for some other entries. Overall, this is probably where the series peaked, and where most people consider the best game to be, which unfortunately means it's nearly all downhill from here. I would like to give a quick mention to a game not brought up very often when talking about the series, which is the ill-fated spin-off, Dirt Showdown. Remember when I went on a tangent earlier about media needing to evolve over time? There's also a counterpoint to that, which is that eventually you hit a point of diminishing returns, and you will begin to lose a large number of people who enjoyed the earlier entries. Dirt Showdown is probably the earliest sign of that. It was a massive change to the series, and was the first Dirt game to feature 0 rally races, with the focus now being placed on demolition derby style events. To be honest, I kinda enjoy how the game feels. For the longest time, I only had the single stage demo to play on Xbox Live Arcade back on the 360 days, but that was still kinda fun. Although, I wouldn't really call this a Dirt game. It just doesn't share enough in common with the other Dirt games. It's much closer to a Fallout 2 or a Wreckfest than a Dirt game. Although I will say, you can currently pick it up on various Steam key shops for about $1. And for that much, this is an amazing deal. although more than 10 or 15 I probably wouldn't bother. But for this, it's a steal. Alright, now where were we? Ah yes, the next mainline Dirt game, which was a whole 6 years away from Dirt 3? Well, did they release anything else during that time? That'll work. In 2015, we got the first of 2 installments in the, well, I wouldn't really call it a spin-off, more of a splitting of the series, with one side becoming the more arcadey casual series, and the other being more sim-focused. In the same vein as Richard Burns' Rally or Assetto Corsa, that side would be known as the Dirt Rally series. For the sake of brevity and the fact that they are 2 of the most similar games in the series, I'm going to group Dirt Rally 1 and its 2019 sequel Dirt Rally 2.0 together. I have a much greater knowledge of Dirt Rally 2, so if I say anything that applies to just the sequel and not to the first entry, my limited experience with it is why. Dirt Rally in many ways was a return to form for the series. It was just pure rally racing, although they did throw in Rallycross for good measure. Dirt Rally is also one of the 2 simulators that I've played that is actually fairly easy to play on a controller, and pretty fun too. While it doesn't have nearly as much flair as the 3 games that preceded it, it didn't really have to. Its main selling point was the immaculately crafted physics engine, and there's enough of a fun game surrounding it to make the overall package pretty fun. Dirt Rally featured a diverse cast of cars from all decades and divisions of rally, rear-wheel drive to all-wheel drive, asphalt to gravel, and they brought them across the world to some of the most famous courses in rallying history. The best part of this game is just how much it challenges the player. This is in many ways the most difficult racing game to come out recently, because it really tests your skills in a way that few other games have. This is like the Crash Bandicoot 4 or, yes, I'm going full game critic here, the Dark Souls of racing games. Because it's just so satisfying when you finally master that rally stage or even just get one position higher on the online leaderboards. Speaking of the leaderboards, one other great part about Dirt Rally is the community, being the most active to this day with thousands of people still playing the game across various platforms. And they share the same love for rallying that the devs did when crafting the whole experience. As a whole, Dirt Rally provides a unique experience tailor-made for the rallying enthusiast, and a true test of skill for any gaming racist looking to get their cars a bit dirty. Would definitely recommend for anyone looking for a great take on the original formula, especially with it being as little as $7.50 on PlayStation as I record this, or just straight up free if you have EA Play or any other subscriptions that include it. I'd definitely give it a try if you haven't already. Before we get back to the mainline series, and no, this isn't a sponsor, I would like to give a quick shout out to some people who helped out by providing some of the music for this video, which came courtesy of Sleeper Clique, headed by a good friend of mine and local musician, Ezzy. They make sorta indie rock, psych pop kind of stuff in the same vein as musicians like George Clanton, Red Vox, or Fishmans, and they've been at it for a good few years now, so if you like that kind of sound and want to check them out, there'll be a link to their channel in the description. Alright, now back to Dirt.
6 right, 120.
Going back 2 years before Rally 2.0 came out, back to 2017, we got a bit of an odd entry. Dirt 4 is the only Dirt game that could be described as the antithesis to the rest of the series. Not because it massively changes the gameplay or immediately shifts the focus away from what the series was building to at that point, but because it's something that rallying, and especially the Dirt games, should never be. Dirt 4 is boring. Dirt 4 is probably the most plainly boring game of the Dirt branded entries, mainly because I don't think the devs or the studio had a concrete idea of what the game was going to be. If you look at the promo material for the game, you'll realize that 1, the game has very little in terms of promotional material with a grand total of 2 distinct trailers, and 2, that this looks nothing like Dirt 3, and it honestly seems to have more in common with the Rally titles than a standard Dirt game. which is what we ended up getting. Dirt 4 was marketed like it was a sim-style rally racer, but instead what we got was a simcade racer that allowed for rally, rallycross, rally raid, and buggy divisions that also allowed you to pick whether you wanted an arcade or sim experience. And the gameplay as a whole doesn't leave much of an impression. It does implement interesting ideas like sponsorships and team ownership responsibilities that give it a more realistic feel, and a dedicated practice mode which gives the players specific tasks to complete to slowly improve their skills over time, but much of that loses its luster as soon as you get more than a few hours in. And the races themselves kind of wear thin relatively quickly, because the physics and environments manage to strike an imperfect balance, where they aren't arcadey and immediately engaging enough to be casually enjoyable like the earlier Dirts, but they're not challenging and rewarding to complete like the rally games are, so it's kind of in an awkward gray area, which isn't helped by the fact that all the tracks feel the same. In Dirt 4, they implemented a system where all the rally tracks were procedurally generated, which sounds cool until you start up a race and realize it's basically like if you built 15 different Hot Wheels tracks out of the same 5 connector pieces. You could only make so many variations and they would only feel so different from each other. Now from that, you may assume I utterly despise this game, but I actually don't. When I first got this game, I did genuinely have some fun with it, but that's also partially because at the time, I hadn't played a Dirt game in close to 3 years, and I wouldn't own Dirt Rally for another year, so that was basically my only option at the time. But when given the choice now, out of all the Dirt games, this is the one I'm least likely to go back to. However, like my thoughts on Dirt 2 versus Dirt 3, even though Dirt 4 might be my least favorite Dirt game, that doesn't make it the worst one, because this is the worst one. You want to know what makes Dirt 5 the worst game in the series? It's the only game in a series of rally games to not have any rally racing. That alone should be reason enough to call this the worst Dirt game, but that's far from its only fault. Whether it's the physics that feel weightless and like I'm playing bumper cars, the tracks that are wider than a Southern Super Speedway, the car list which removed a lot of the classic cars that gave a better feel for the history of the motorsport and replaced them with a bunch of trucks, SUVs, sports cars, and superlights, the awful influencer angle that literally every racing game was pushing at the time, or the fact that the single player is extremely linear and repetitive and the multiplayer is... No, seriously, the multiplayer on Dirt 5, a 2.5-year-old game as I'm writing this, has less players online than Dirt 3, an over 12-year-old game. And based on reviews from when it came out, it wouldn't have even worked even if there were still players playing it, because the queues made it take forever to join and were extremely unstable. Unlike Dirt 3, where I can literally join a match right now. All of this footage I used for Dirt 3's multiplayer was me on random lobbies within a month of this video going up. That's just plain sad. Now, there are 2 reasons why this game doesn't get put straight into shit tier with big rigs, and why I personally rate it above Dirt 4. First, they did introduce a very cool new feature to the series, which is the ability to create an entire race course from scratch, and to be able to play with your friends. Which was kind of stolen by other games like Horizon 5 later on, but still. While not perfect in its implementation, this is a great idea that I could see being a great thing to build upon in future releases. And second, this game, although certainly not my favorite in the series, does have an actually interesting style and aesthetic, which isn't something I can really say about Dirt 4. To me, while Dirt 5 is a bit too much, Dirt 4 isn't nearly enough. You know what I mean? So, as a whole, I would put Dirt 5 just barely above 4, but I wouldn't really recommend either of these games because they don't reflect the highs that the other games in the series can reach. As a whole, I think this series has produced some of the greatest works in terms of racing games, with each entry constantly evolving the formula and, mostly, making hit after hit with each installment, keeping the series fresh and fun to play at the same time. I think looking back at these games, they pretty well accomplished their goal of portraying the feeling of driving a rally car flat out, and the feeling that Colin McRae likely felt every time he stepped into his iconic rally cars. I think this series is the best example of rally racing. I think they best encapsulate the art of rally.